watching out there on YouTube. My name is Councillor Carl Quilliam. This is my first meeting as chair. So before I start, I just wanted to quickly give thanks to Councillor Mundy, who chaired the committee for the last 2.5 years in his absence, and I think did a brilliant job in that time in getting the committee to where it is now, and also to Councillor Kirby for her valuable contributions in her time as on the committee as well. There are also there's a number of councillors who are attending this meeting as observers, and what I've said in advance of the meeting is that those councillors, as much as they can't ask questions directly, if they want to send questions to me in the chat through the wonder of technology, then I'm more than happy to ask those if those don't come up in the general discussion with the committee. So without further ado, I don't think we have any apologies for absence. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? Nope. Well, I think then we can go straight on to the notes from the last meeting. Obviously, I wasn't here, but for those that that were, is everybody happy with those?
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right. Well, we'll speed through straight to the presentation on Merton's housing development viability report. If I can hand over, and I think we're going to get a presentation up on the screen as well. Anthony, if you're happy to, you start kicking us off.
I'm just getting the PowerPoints. Thank you, Councillor. So I've been invited to speak to you this evening about a study we did for the council over the last 4 or 5 months. And this focuses particularly on housing delivery, affordable housing delivery within Merton, and how that fits within the local plan wider process of that review. And I think the first point I'd like to make in regards to how viability works, before I get into the detail, is that the planning system is clearly there to mediate between public and private interests. You rely upon the private sector to bring sites forward, and they will be seeking to maximise the return they make from selling land. But clearly the planning authority will be seeking to maximise the benefits that the public sector and the community will receive from development. And viability is really just how one goes about mediating between the public and the private interest and deciding what can be afforded on particular sites in terms of affordable housing and other benefits. So that just sort of frames our discussion for later. What I'm going to do, hopefully won't speak too long, because I want to leave time for questions and comments. First of all, just talk through very briefly some of the concepts around viability and how we approach testing viability in Merton. I'll talk a very little bit about how Merton fits within the wider London context. I'll go briefly through the study results, and the study itself is quite a long document, and I'm not going to bore you with the details this evening, but just to highlight what implications they have for how you set policy. So that will lead into a brief discussion on policy approaches, and then we can have discussion and any questions you have for me. So first main topic, to look at concepts and approaches. Your local plan sets out your vision as an authority for your area. But like most other local authorities, you don't actually bring forward developments yourself. You're looking to the private sector, mainly to bring forward sites for development. So you're relying upon those landowners to bring forward sites to deliver the scale of housing you're looking to deliver and all of the benefits you're seeking in the plan. So because of that, clearly the private sector needs to be incentivised to bring their sites forward. If policy requirements were so onerous that the landowner would not be incentivised, clearly nothing would be developed, there'd be no sites coming forward and therefore no affordable housing. So there is this need for the balance between what you're seeking in terms of policy and the returns that landowners can receive. There's also a wider point around housing land supply in the wider sense, and how sites could be used for other uses. And this isn't so much of a problem for Merton, but in some boroughs where you have high demand for office space or retail space or other uses, there is also this dynamic between what could happen between the option of using sites for residential versus other uses. And that's another thing to be mindful of. As an authority, you are required by national policy and guidance to test your policies, to demonstrate to a planning inspectorate examination that your policies won't render schemes unviable, that you can deliver the scale of housing you plan for in your plan at the same time as ensuring they are viable and deliverable. So those are the key things that frame the exercise that we did. And this slide tries to really, I guess, sum up in one single slide the concept that we're dealing with when we talk about viability in planning. And this concept applies to any kind of development. So any site that might come forward has a use in existing form. So it could be an industrial site, it could be a car park, an office building, or existing residential. So any site has a value in its current use. So that's represented in the figure here by the blue bar, the EUV, or existing use value. By granting planning consent on a site, you are facilitating an uplift in land value that can fund various things. So if we were to imagine we were in a no planning world for a second, so there was no planning requirements, no affordable housing, then a fully private housing scheme would deliver a value in my exercise here of 12 million. So that would be a £6 million uplift against the existing use value. And it's from that £6 million uplift that would be seeking to fund all the planning requirements that the local plan seeks. So if we then include 40% affordable housing in this scheme, that's represented by the green bar, you can see that the value that would generate the landowner would be 7 million. So that's higher than the £6 million existing use value they have at the moment. So that scheme would proceed because they're securing a return against their current value. If, however, in this particular case, the affordable housing were increased to 50%, and that's the yellow bar at the end, you can see there that the residual value would fall to 5 million, and that would be lower than the existing use value of 6 million, and that site wouldn't come forward. So that's how schemes are tested, and it's really as simple as that. It's looking at how far the land value increases and what impact policies have on that increase. We do this through what we call the residual land value approach, and this is what developers will use when they're working out what to pay for sites. And it really looks at these two key things: scheme value, so what the scheme is worth when it's being completed. So if you're building a residential scheme, the value of the flats sold to private occupiers, and the value of the affordable housing that's disposed of to a housing association. And then on the other side, you've got the cost of delivering that scheme. So you've got the build costs, you'll have the profit to the developer, and that's key because they need to be incentivized to deliver the scheme and take the risk. They'll incur the cost of professional fees for architects and others. There'll be SIL in section 106. And then you're left with this residual amount. So the bit that's left over, the residual land value, that's what, in theory, the developer would pay for that site, given the particular values of the residential units and the affordable housing requirement. So our approach really does this exercise across a range of sites across the borough to test how viable schemes are with the particular policy requirements. And I'm very often asked in seminars like this, well, why haven't we secured more affordable housing in the past? What's been going on? And this chart, I won't dwell into this too much, but this chart shows what's happened to affordable housing delivery since 1990, when we first had Section 106 agreements that deliver affordable housing. And the blue bar, sorry, the blue line is the affordable housing percentage of all units delivered over that period of time. And then the red line shows you what's happened to house prices across London over an equivalent period, and they only go back to 1995, so I can't show you anything before that. And what you generally see is that during periods of growth, when values are growing, affordable housing delivery also goes up. So during the period between 1998 and 2007, when we had very high increases in house prices, we saw an increase in affordable housing delivery as schemes were becoming more viable. During the recession between 2007 and 2011, we had a bit of an odd scenario whereby the affordable housing level increased while values were first falling and then recovering slightly. And that's because the government at the time was putting in a lot of money to grant fund affordable housing, and the HAs were delivering where private developers were stepping out of the market. But the most odd period is between 2011 and the period ending sort of 2017-18, where we saw a very big increase in house prices, but a very big drop in affordable housing delivery. So you can see there the blue line goes down from 45% affordable housing to about 30% affordable, and despite there being a very big increase in sales values. There's well, two main reasons for that. The first is that grant funding was severely cut during that period as the coalition government sought to reduce public spending. The second reason was around guidance for local authorities and developers on how they tested viability of developments. Central government, in effect, gave control of that guidance, or the ground rules, to the RICS, which is the body representing the surveying industry, many of whom are acting for developers and landowners. So unsurprisingly, the guidance favoured the landowner and developer interests over the local authority and the public sector interest. The main part of the guidance was that when I talked earlier about existing use values, the RICS said instead of using existing use value, one should use market value as the minimum land value for which a scheme would have to achieve to be viable. This was problematic because clearly developers sometimes pay too much for land based on the hope that values will increase over time to save them. If you then use that in a viability assessment, you're going to find that very quickly you'll squeeze out the potential for schemes to deliver affordable housing. And to illustrate that point, what I've got here is a series of schemes that we looked at for another South West London borough. And the blue bars are the prices that the developers paid for those sites in the market. And then the red bars are what the same developers said their schemes were worth in their viability assessments they submitted with their planning applications. And as you can see, there are some very extreme differences between the prices paid for those sites and what the same developers were saying those schemes were worth when they brought them forward. The most extreme example was Scheme E, where you can see that the viability assessment barely registers on that graph. It's so small you can't see it, yet the same developer paid almost £100,000 per unit to buy the site. If you then take those values of prices paid as the RICS advocated and use those in assessments of other schemes, clearly you're going to drive out any potential for affordable housing delivery on all your schemes coming forward. So that was a big problem, and I'd say that was one of the main reasons why affordable housing delivery dropped over that period. Fortunately, the government introduced a new planning practice guidance in 2019. They consulted on this in the previous year. Paragraph 14 of that guidance says that the benchmark land value, or the land value we use to test viability, has to be based on existing use value. You can also use an alternative use value, so you could assume a site could be used for an office or an industrial use instead of whatever might be there at the moment. It has to be a policy compliant scheme. So critically for you as a planning authority, what this has done is to move viability testing both at plan making stage and also at the development management stage, away from market value or prices paid for sites towards a metric that will enable you to secure the full uplift in value when sites come forward. So that's a positive. It's too early to tell what impact that will have in terms of actual delivery. But I think given what we've seen so far, it's been very helpful to secure increases in affordable housing. So next topic is just to very briefly touch on affordable housing delivery in Merton in the wider London context. And this is useful just to set the scene in terms of how you might go about setting policies going forward. London as a whole has delivered 17% affordable housing over the 3 years to 2017. This is the latest data we have available. The latest data, I believe, will be coming out fairly soon. Against that, Merton delivered 14% affordable housing. So as you can see, by no means the lowest. City of London and bizarrely Harrow were the lowest, with Harrow losing stock, presumably because of estate regeneration schemes. But nevertheless, Merton is about 14%. And I think one of the key reasons for that is that you have your housing supply is predominantly smaller sites. So you have a very small number of larger developments where affordable housing is secured. And because of that, your delivery looks fairly low. So we'll come back to that key point a bit later on in terms of policy. So moving on to the results of our study. What we did was to test a number of development typologies, so representative developments, to consider all the types of scheme that might come forward or have come forward over the plan period. So we had 10 smaller schemes of 9 or fewer units. As I said, this is a very important element of housing supply in Merton. And then 12 medium schemes between 10 and 75 units with a range of schemes of houses, of flats, and then mixed houses and flats. And then larger developments between 100 and 1,000 units, all flatted schemes. And some of those schemes we reflected some ground floor on the ground floor retail to reflect if they were, for example, in a high street or a busy street. That would be the most appropriate use on those ground floor areas. The next key point was that in Merton, sales values vary significantly. So in parts of the borough, sales values are just under £5,000 per square metre. In other parts on the west, Wimbledon and so on, you're at over £10,000 per square metre. So from a policy perspective, it's important to recognise that you do have that degree of variation in values and therefore differences in viability between different parts of the borough. The other thing that we had to test is looking at different existing use values of sites. So that's critical because that will determine the hurdle land value rate that schemes need to achieve in order to become viable. Quite a few of the sites, especially the smaller sites, tend to be existing residential schemes that are being demolished and then replaced by an uplift in residential development area. And they have the highest values, as you might expect, of the existing use values we tested. Then we have secondary offices that will, again, have come to their end of their useful life, and there's no demand for them anymore. So they will be redeveloped for other uses. Secondary industrial space, where landowners believe they can secure a better value from residential. And then we have community sites, community uses that have a low value. And finally, garden land, another undeveloped land, which has the lowest value of all at £500,000 per hectare. So as you can see, again, a very wide range of hurdle land values that we need to deal with in viability testing in the borough. So just to pick up on that last point about sales values, I'm not sure how well you can see this, but this is basically the sub postcodes in Merton, and the darker the colour, the higher the sales values. So this is a pattern you'll be familiar with, that the western part of the borough has the highest values, fairly high in the centre, but then they are lower as you move to the south and to the east. So from a policy perspective, your policy needs to reflect those differences and to be able to cope with them when schemes come forward. So why are these two things important? So what we've got here is the results of some of the schemes we tested with two sales values. So the green bar, I'm going colourblind. The green bar is the value generated by one of the schemes, assuming a sales value of £8,250 per square metre. So that's towards the upper end of the value range in the borough. And then the blue bars are a scheme with values at £6,500 per square metre, so quite a bit lower. What this tells us is that if our hurdle land value, our benchmark land value, is just under 5 million, so a low value community use, then we can secure affordable housing in the lower value area at 20%, because that's the point where the blue bar exceeds the red line. In the higher value area, we're okay across the board at delivering affordable housing up to 50%. And that's the difficulty that we have in setting policy, that you'll have this degree of variation between different parts of the borough, where some parts of the borough can afford 50% affordable housing, other parts a lesser proportion. That gets more complicated when you consider that we have different benchmark land values. So the red line, as you can see, that's the benchmark land value. That's now gone up to 10 million, reflecting a higher value existing use. What that does, that knocks out all of the viability in the lower value part of the borough that we tested here, but it also knocks out the 50% affordable housing in the higher value area. So that's something to bear in mind. And then if we go up to the highest existing use values, which is existing residential, you find that all of these schemes then become unviable and therefore unlikely to come forward unless values increase. Now, you won't be able to see the numbers here, but this is really just to give you a picture in terms of the colours. And what we've got here is, if you look at the report itself, when you have a moment, you'll see there are tables in the report that list out the 30 developments we've tested, and then we've plotted the values they generate with various affordable housing levels between 0 and 50%, going from left to right on these small coloured boxes. And then we compare those residual values to the 5 benchmark land values we talked about earlier. Where you see a green cell, that means that the scheme is viable at that particular affordable housing level. And where you see a red cell, that's the reverse. The scheme generates a lower value than the benchmark land value. And the two sets of numbers we've got here on the left-hand side, that's from a lower value part of the borough, and on the right-hand side, that's from a higher value part of the borough. And what it tells us is that really there's no one position where you can say that a certain affordable housing level is viable in all circumstances. There are always cells on the tables you can find where there'll be something that's viable in another scenario, in equivalent place, it's unviable. And what that leads us to is to a point where you have to say, well, there needs to be some flexibility in the policy to deal with those different circumstances. I'll come back to that point later on. And then on small sites, this is critical because the council's seeking to secure financial contributions from small sites because, as I said before, they form a very large form of supply for the borough. In the lower value areas, you'll see that where we have existing residential houses or flats being redeveloped, those sites wouldn't be able to provide any contribution to new affordable housing because the existing use values are so high. But that's the top row with all the red. On the bottom sets of tables, this is where existing garden land or other open undeveloped land is being brought forward for development. And there you can see that there's quite a bit of green, meaning that schemes are able to contribute towards affordable housing. And that's clearly going to be an important source of supply. Undeveloped land, people developing in rear gardens, alongside other forms of sites that will be brought forward for these smaller sites. And then this is the equivalent, again, small sites in high value areas. And there you can start to see that they are viable to a degree when you're bringing forward existing residential. So the top two bars are basically knocking down a house and then putting back a small number of flats. The green starts to creep in to 0 and 10% affordable housing, so they could contribute to a degree. And then sites brought forward on garden and open land, again, very viable and able to contribute towards affordable housing delivery. I need to just very briefly touch on some policy trade-offs. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, there's always going to be this trade-off between the public interest and the landowner's interest, but also within the amount of value you secure from the land, there's going to be trade-offs between different policy objectives you might want to adopt. And the first one is clearly the tenure mix of the affordable housing, there is an impact of different tenures and different levels of affordability on the overall percentage you can secure. So the lower the cost of housing to the occupier, the lower the value to the developer of that housing, and therefore the less affordable housing they can provide. So we tested, as an example, 70% rented housing and 30% intermediate or shared ownership housing versus an equal split between the two. And that does have an impact on viability, a positive impact of 50-50 versus 70-30. But clearly, you've got to balance that against the priority need that you have, which is for rented housing. So clearly, in most circumstances, you're going to want to stick to the 70-30 rented to shared ownership and not adopt a 50-50 split. But that could be something that can be deployed on a site-by-site basis, potentially when there are viability issues, instead of foregoing the overall percentage. And then we looked at the climate change policies the council is considering, and these would increase costs by between 1.5% and 6.5%, depending on the option adopted. So what impact does that have? So if everything else stays the same, and you're simply increasing those costs on the development, in high value areas, there'd be a 2% reduction in affordable housing to offset those extra costs. But in lower value areas, there could be a 10% reduction in affordable housing to offset the climate change costs. And it's very important to say that the precise impact is going to vary when sites come forward, depending on the existing use value. So it might be in some cases, or indeed all cases, sites could actually deliver both the climate change requirements as well as the full affordable housing with the policy compliant tenure mix. So onto policy approaches. What you could do as a borough, you could reflect some of the differences in sales values that I've outlined and have different policy levels, different target levels of affordable housing in different parts of the borough to reflect the differences in viability. I think that would be a fairly difficult thing to introduce, given that you have no clear differences between where one sales value starts and another begins. It's always shades of grey, it's not black and white. So any policy, the way you seek to adopt different levels of affordable housing, you've got to put a line on the map, and drawing that line is always very difficult. You've also got the complication of different types of scheme having variable viability, and also you've got different benchmark land values, which also introduce another layer of complication. So because of that, we've recommended that you have a single policy target for affordable housing across the borough as a whole, and we'll come back to that later. In terms of how you apply the policy, the planning practice guidance advocates that you adopt a target that is viable in almost all circumstances. that's fine if all your sites are very similar, and all the development types are very similar. In a place like Merton, that's very rarely the case. You have very different schemes coming forward, all of which will have different characteristics and different benchmark land values. Therefore, it's impossible, as we saw earlier, to say there's a particular affordable housing level that's viable in almost all circumstances. So because of that, we've advocated using what we've termed there the maximal reasonable approach, where you have a relatively high policy target, but accept that it won't always be met on every single site, and that the maximum level of affordable housing is established by looking at the viability assessment on a scheme when it comes forward through the development management process. That's, in our experience, the best way of dealing with not just the differences between sites, but also dealing with the fact that you're looking at a 15-year local plan. So you're wanting that policy to be flexible enough to deal with the points in time when values are falling as well as increasing. So there's sufficient flexibility in the policy to allow sites to come forward, even when the market is in a difficult place. The next point around the differences between the outcomes of the study really do point to the policy approach having flexibility rather than requiring every single site to provide a certain affordable housing level. So I understand you're recommending or seeking to recommend a 40% target. That's supported by the evidence base, as you would have seen earlier. The evidence points to some schemes being viable at 40%, sometimes slightly more. But overall, that's a policy target that is realistic over the plan period. Then just quickly to touch on payments in lieu. As I said, small sites are a very big proportion of housing supply in Merton, and haven't currently been delivering contributions towards affordable housing. In the emerging policy, sites will be required to provide a financial contribution equivalent to 20% of on-site affordable housing. And that's an approach that reflects many other London boroughs in their up-to-date local plans. The results of our study tell us that the ability to contribute will vary between different sites, depending on their existing use. So if you're bringing forward existing residential sites for new housing schemes, they will be more difficult to secure contributions from than sites being brought forward on greenfield or garden land. So again, the 20% on equivalent target is viable in some circumstances. Again, depending on the benchmark land values and also the values of the residential units. It won't always be met, but it's a target that is realistic and supported by the study. And that's all I have to say, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
I've seen Councillor Latif waving first, so I'll let him ask the first question. Thank you for that, Anthony. That was really interesting. And yeah, if people just want to wave at me when they want to speak, and Joel, Councillor Stanford as well on the phone, do speak up if you want to speak, either now or after Councillor Latif's question. Okay, go for it.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Anthony, for a very good presentation. On one of the slides, which showed all the various boroughs in London and how much affordable they can provide, or they provided, I think Merton was 14%, but I noticed at the bottom of the table, Harrow minus 10% or minus 4%. What happened there? Why has it gone into negative? Is it suddenly becoming very influential and lots of private schemes being developed but not affordable? So can you please sort of clarify what's happened there?
Yeah, it's a mix of things. They've had a very big estate regeneration programme, so they've been losing existing social housing, and so that's a negative. And the negative hasn't been offset by affordable housing being delivered through private sector schemes. And I think that will correct itself, because it's an issue of the timing of delivery. So with estate regen schemes, you often get schemes being knocked down, and then in the subsequent years you get delivery of new affordable housing units. So I think if we look at the numbers when they come out for 2019, they'll probably show a fairly big increase in delivery, as the not demolished social housing is replaced by the new social housing. I think it's a question of that sort of lag in delivery.
Okay, thank you. And just one quick question. I presume after Brexit, a lot of things are going to change. Material costs will go up, construction labour costs will go up. And I still see that a lot of developers paying too much for the sites. It just happens that no matter how much you tell them, they still end up paying too much for the sites. So then they go down the route of doing the viability assessment, and the viability assessment says that actually, because construction costs have gone up, you're allowed to make 20% profit. There really is no way but providing the affordable content. So how do you see that correcting itself in 2021 and going forward, especially when they're saying there is going to be quite a dramatic recession happening in the next couple of years?
Yeah. So I think the first key point is that on prices paid for sites, and developers arguably paying too much. As I said in the presentation, government has helpfully clarified the rules on doing viability assessments, and they've said that you can no longer use market value or the prices paid for sites in the viability assessment. So if a developer now pays too much for a site, they can't use that as an argument to reduce the affordable housing going forward. They have to use a value reflecting what the site's worth in whatever use it's in today. So you're able to capture the full uplift in value arising from the grant of planning consent. So that's a helpful thing. Second point is that on Brexit, clearly what's going to happen in the next few years, there's a great degree of uncertainty. We don't quite know what's going to happen with the labour market, whether we'll have enough skilled and unskilled labour coming in, and that depends on how the government sets the rules for immigration and how we do or not do a deal with the European Union and our trading partners over there. So yes, a huge amount of uncertainty, also uncertainty on sales values as well. We've just had the biggest contraction in the economy in history. We're predicted to recover going into 2021, but we won't be back to 2019 output until 2022. There could be a big increase in unemployment that could impact on the housing market. So all of those things will combine together in some way, and there will be some form of impact on housing markets. It could be in London. It could be a fairly benign impact because unemployment will largely affect, unfortunately, those on lower incomes and those who are less likely to be actively buying houses at this point in their life. So it could be that the housing market escapes any degree of huge damage because of that. But clearly we need to see, and that takes me back to the point about flexibility. If we do enter a period of housing market recession, the way you structured your policy will be able to cope with that, and your policies won't be the thing that stops schemes going forward, and that's really important for housing supply.
I'm gonna just follow up quickly with a question from me, then I'll take Councillor Pearson and Councillor Fairclough. So related to what Councillor Latif was talking about, could you talk a little bit about how you make the assumptions around build costs? Because I think that that's one of the big things that as an authority we will have to test against the assumptions that the developers are making. And I think that does relate to how things go up and down in terms of Brexit, but also something like the measures around climate change, for example. You clearly made an assumption of particular levels of cost at this moment in time, and obviously those costs could go up because of various factors, but similarly they could go down if that's something that's adopted widely, and there are kind of economies of scale and things. So could you talk around that a little bit so we can understand it a bit better?
Yeah. So how we deal with costs is that we collect, well, we don't, the RICS collect costs of live development. So they'll invite developers to submit their data. So when they tender a scheme, they'll submit the tender from the contractor. That gets aggregated into a database. So we can draw down data on different types of development across wherever we're looking at in terms of testing. So that there is a set of data for Merton based on live schemes that have come forward, as there is for every other London borough. So we can compare the costs the developer is claiming in their viability assessment with costs that have actually been incurred on live developments. And we can assess how reasonable the developer's claims are against those tenders. So that's the first point. The climate change costs, there was a study done for the borough and some other London boroughs on the cost of climate change and technology required to meet the carbon zero requirements. And as you rightly say, those costs will decrease over time as more developers adopt them and the technology becomes more refined. So as these things work their way into building regulations, and everyone has to do them, developers will adapt, and those costs will be decreasing. So we'll see an interim period whereby planning policy is slightly ahead of where building regs are, where costs might be slightly higher, but eventually building regs and costs will catch up with policy, and there'll no longer be that impact.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Pearce.
Thank you. Thanks for that. There was an awful lot of information there to take in, and I'm afraid, without the documents in front of me, it was quite difficult. But one thing has always stuck out to me when I've been to planning meetings, when I've sat on planning committees, when you look at the amount of affordable housing that developers are prepared to supply, and they offer a payment in lieu of affordable housing, how does that possibly benefit a council if they accept that payment as because they will, to get their target of affordable housing, they would have to look elsewhere, and I don't see how that helps us meet our targets, no matter how realistic those targets are, if we are going to accept money that we can't use because there aren't sites available that will deliver what we need. Thank you.
I think I might hand that one to Tara to answer, if I may.
All right.
Thanks, Anthony. Hi, Councillor Pearce. Yes, we are, alongside this work, developing the local plan. We are developing a policy with which the council could use to select which schemes they spend funding for affordable housing. Other councils have already done this, so we're learning a lot from them. Usually the way other councils do it is two main ways. If they own their own social housing stock, they spend it obviously on their own social housing stock, and that applies to most London boroughs. In a couple of other London boroughs, like Merton, we don't own our housing stock. So what we do is we work with housing associations to increase the amount of affordable housing. So we use that money and give it to a scheme where it might be, say, 40% affordable housing now, and we could use it to bring it up to 50 or 60%, or it might be 10% affordable housing now, we could use it to bring it up to 20 or 30%. And the work we're doing in parallel with this is working out really how we would select the most appropriate project, given a choice of projects, if we introduce this policy and get some funding in. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does in some part. May I have a quick follow-up to that? The point the other point at issue is that where the housing stock will be built, where affordable housing is most viable, is not normally in the areas of the most need. How do we balance that?
That's we're lucky enough in Merton to have a certain level of affordable housing right across the borough. But the issues we struggle with in Merton are the ones that Anthony's raised. Over 90% of our developments are on small sites, and that's sites of less than 10 homes. We've looked back over 12 or 13 years, and right across the development trajectory, we have heaps of small sites and very few large ones. And councillors will be aware that it's only sites over 10 homes and above that we can ask for affordable housing on. So one of the ways we might use in the future to spend money we get for affordable housing is on targeting smaller sites. And there are now some housing associations who are focused on smaller sites because they recognise in urban areas you get lots more smaller sites coming forward than you do larger sites. So targeting smaller sites would enable that spread to be right across the borough rather than just on large site areas.
Thanks for that, Tara. Is that okay?
I mean, could I have just one more quick question?
As long as it's quick.
We talk about the affordability of green spaces or available spaces that are not developed, but surely in this borough, that is one of our assets where we have more open spaces, green spaces and so on than most other boroughs. That's what makes this place worth living, really, one of the things. That's just a comment. Don't have to answer.
Well, just very briefly to respond to that, yes, clearly protected metropolitan open land wouldn't be developed in the main. I was really referring to undeveloped backland and infield sites that wouldn't normally be considered as public open space but are undeveloped. But I fully agree that clearly the open spaces are what make Merton a special place.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Fairclough.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I've got a quick question for Anthony, but also probably a question for Tara as well, although I'm quite reassured by what you're saying, Tara, about the use of the payments in lieu, which I think is something that we'd look forward to seeing. One of the charts you showed, Anthony, you said it showed that in periods of growth there was an increase in delivery of affordable housing, but it seemed to me that both of the periods of recession actually showed a substantial amount of delivery of affordable, and the reasons that you gave for that were actually around government support and sort of the regulation of it, which was going to bring me into the use of the payments in lieu, which, as I said, I'm very reassured to hear that we're looking at how we might use those. My question to you, Anthony, was, you know, what you seem to be proposing looks an awful lot like what we have at the moment already, and therefore how much improvement in delivery do you think, if any, this policy change would see? And then I suppose my question to Tara is, as I said, the use of the payments in lieu, fantastic. One of the problems we've had in my ward is actually in the sort of medium-sized developments, housing associations being unwilling to look at the number of units that were available. And so I don't know if there's, you mentioned that there were some housing associations who would be willing to work on smaller sites, but I know particularly in the Apostles recently, there was a site that did try a number of housing associations and got absolutely nowhere. And then that brings me then to the role of the council's own housing company, which hasn't been mentioned. Anthony mentioned, you know, not bringing forward developments ourselves. Well, of course we do, or are supposed to. So I wondered if there was a role there that the administration saw, a changed role for the housing company. So sorry to mix my questions, Carl, but a question for Anthony and one for Tara.
No problem, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I do agree that the proposed policy does look something like the old policy, the main difference being an increase from 35 to 40%. I think one of the critical differences between current policy and what you're seeking to do is the approach to small sites, where at the moment you don't see contributions from small developments, but you will be doing in the new local plan. And as Tara has said, if 90% of housing supply is coming forward as small sites, it will make a big difference in terms of what you can deliver if those 90% of sites start to contribute towards affordable housing. The second point I would say, it's very early in terms of new government guidance that has moved away, as I said, from the RICS approach of market value towards looking at existing use value, which does help to drive up delivery. I think over the next few years, you'll start to see that because of that different approach to how viability is undertaken, that levels of affordable housing will start to increase.
Tara, do you want to come in there?
Yes. Just to recap, you were, Councillor Fairclough, you were asking about 2 points. One about smaller, sort of medium-sized sites. Yes, you're absolutely right. We have had too many occasions, unfortunately, where development of maybe 40 homes has offered 15, say, for affordable housing. And the housing associations simply have been absolutely clear that they don't want to take it up. And we are reliant on housing associations to run affordable housing. The reasons that the housing associations have told us, and they've been explicit to all councils, this isn't just Merton, is that managing lots and lots of small sites costs them more money, and that they much prefer managing much larger sites that they can own and manage and run and look after the landscaping and do all the things they need to do, rather than do that pepper potted across lots and lots of different areas, especially where they might be sharing, say, roads or landscaping with another private sector party as well. The good news is that because this has happened over London and the southeast, there are now some housing associations emerging that specialise in small sites. And the Greater London Authority is getting together a list of housing associations that are interested in picking up smaller sites. So I'm hopeful in the future we'll be able to see very, very few cases where we can see that the landowner has reached out to housing associations and that they've all said, not for us, thanks. I'm hoping that that tide is starting to turn. You asked about the housing company and could we give affordable housing to Merton developments. The short answer is I don't think we could always do that. I think we could if they were building affordable housing, but we couldn't obviously do that if they were building private housing. But I'm afraid I'm not legally expert enough on that issue to be able to answer fully tonight.
Thanks for that, Tara. Do you want any follow-up, Councillor Fairclough, or should we move on?
No, thank you. The housing company, I think, would be interesting to have a bit more information about that in due course, and if the housing company might be being used in a different way going forward.
Carl, it's Geraldine. Could I have a quick word, please?
I was just going to come to you, Geraldine.
Okay.
Yes, go for it. Ask your question.
Go for it. Not quite sure where to start, really, but no, I was just wondering, thinking about this, particularly, obviously, the issue of affordable housing. If your calculations, your future calculations on the amount that you can generate over the next few years, does this takes account, I'm sure, of the 3 regeneration projects being carried out by Clarion, where a lot of the housing is going to be increased. The amount of affordable housing is going to be increased. There will be excess housing built instead of the rehousing the existing tenants. There will be far more affordable housing on those sites to be able to sell. So I'm just assuming that you will have taken that figure into account when you're calculating how much affordable housing you intend to build in the future. Is that right?
In terms of policy on new sites coming forward, I think the two things are slightly different. So one thing is you've got your overall supply across the borough from all sources of delivery, and clearly, as you rightly say, the clarion schemes, if providing more than the housing that's there at the moment, that will contribute towards an overage delivery.
Yeah.
That will help to offset some of the other sites that can't quite meet the 40% requirement that you're seeking. So when you take the two sources of supply together, they'll balance out, and you'll hopefully hit the 40% target from all sources. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, more or less, yes, sort of, yes. The other thing I just wanted to pick up on was this issue about the following the viability, the feasibility studies on the viability, where they can't reach the target, and they are asked to make a contribution. It's been my experience in the past that a lot of the contribution is made to either the Section 106 or SIL funds, and I don't know of a great deal that's actually been used towards affordable housing or housing on other sites. I mean, a case in point is myself recently, where I was going to apply through the ward allocation funding for an extra table tennis table on Figs Marsh because it was so popular. But I was very happy to receive one through Section 106 and SIL money from Tim Catley. So I'm not quite sure how that works and how the SIL and Section 106 money plays into the equation, if you like.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Normally, any payments in lieu for affordable housing would be ring-fenced for affordable housing, so there'd be different pots of money from the SIL and the 106 contributions that are paid by schemes. Going forward, there would still be the 106 monies that can fund other things other than affordable housing, but the money paid for affordable housing would have to deliver affordable housing and would be ring-fenced.
Thanks for that, Anthony. I'm very mindful of time at this point. I know we've got another presentation coming up. I know, Councillor Butler, you haven't asked a question yet, so I want to give you a quick opportunity to ask one if you want to. But otherwise, if everyone's happy, and I know this is something that everyone's very keen on and interested in, but if everyone's happy, we can move on, and any follow-up questions can come through after the meeting. Sorry, Councillor Fairclough, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just building on Geraldine's point, really, was the payments in lieu, I appreciate they're not for smaller sites at the moment, but what are the existing payments in lieu of affordable housing contribution used for?
Shall I take that one, Anthony? Anthony Lee? Yes. At the moment, well, they are used for affordable homes. And as Anthony Lee said, we haven't had a policy seeking contributions for quite some time. We had one many years ago, probably a decade ago, but we would be now reintroducing this policy, so we can expect to attract a bit more funding. There have been schemes in the recent past that have made financial contributions, and that's actually one of the exact reasons we're working up a policy by which to spend them. Because at the moment we get a very small amount of funding, and some years ago we used it to fund extra affordable homes at Mitcham Gasworks. But now that we've got a few other schemes that have come in, larger schemes under the existing policy that have made financial contributions, we do need a fair and equitable way of making sure that that's spent on affordable housing. So while the local plan has driven the need to create a way of spending it, the fact that we have some small amount of money in the bank that needs spending has also been one of the reasons we're coming up with this way of spending it now that's fair and equitable.
Thanks for that, Tara. Well, if there's nothing else from anyone, or if there is, if you can follow up with me and Tara and Anthony after, that would be great. But yes, if we can move on to the next presentation. Thank you very much, Anthony, for your presentation. That was brilliant.
No
and to you and Tara for answering all of our questions on this. Catherine, we got you up next?
Yes, I am next. Let me share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that now.
Yep.
Perfect. So good evening, councillors. My name is Catherine Fox and I work in the Future Merton team. Tonight we're going to be updating you on the Merton character study. So this is a piece of work that's been funded through the GLA's Home Building Capacity Fund, which aims to increase housing delivery in London boroughs. We've actually got 3 projects going as part of this funding, which is the housing delivery research, the character study, which we're going to tell you about tonight, and some small sites guidance. The New London Plan has identified that Merton needs 980 new homes every year to meet the housing need. To date, on the character study, we've had a consultant helping us, and they've undertaken extensive analysis of Merton's history, development, typology, and character. They sent out a community group engagement survey in August. They also had a resident survey in September, and a couple of weeks ago we held a workshop for residents and residents associations. So starting off, a character study is looking at the borough, and it's looking at things that are more than buildings and spaces. They're also looking at the social, historical, and physical aspects of the borough and the interplay between these factors. This can include things like blue and green networks, the topography, the land use, the identity, as well as looking at the buildings, so the density of the buildings, the way that they address the street, the materials and the scale and the massing, but also what makes a place for people, the evolution, the identity, the social economics, and that all feeds into their recommendations for future growth. So the public consultation that went out in September, we had a really good response. We had over 400 people who responded, and they provided lots of comments. Part of this survey, we checked the boundaries that were being proposed, which we'll show you in a second. We also took this as an opportunity to ask residents to score their neighbourhoods, which gave us some quantitative data. And that's what's on your screen now. So the graph, it's a web graph. So the neighbourhoods were scored on a scale of 1 to 10, based on the following themes, which were transport, environment, housing, economy, amenities and facilities, streets and spaces, traffic and parking, and safety. So the different coloured lines, one represents each neighbourhood. You can see that some neighbourhoods scored better than others in different themes. So for example, Mitcham scored only a 5 on safety, whereas the other neighbourhoods scored between 7 and 8. Now, this is going to be really interesting in informing the character study for identifying potential areas which could be renewed or improved. And that's not only the buildings and the housing in areas, but also how we can look to use SIL or Section 106 money or developments themselves to improve the public realm or the social amenities. So this is just a quick map showing you where the responses were received from the survey. So we had a really good spread all across the borough. We pushed out the survey to our local plan consultation database. It went out on social media, and we also emailed all the residents associations. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Abri to talk more about the character study.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm Abre Ete, also part of the Future Merton team. And so I'll just talk through more of the character study and some of the more, I guess, technical aspects of it. So as Catherine mentioned in the previous slide, there are sort of three main things that go into understanding character and future growth. So alongside existing developments and physical characteristics, an analysis of the history of each area of the borough has been carried out. And elements of this analysis include things like the borough's street patterns, building types, how the borough's character has been evolving over time, the uses and town centers, social history, and even things like identity and the psyche, or the kind of social composition of the place. And this is all to say that character is something that, although it's established, is constantly changing with these different aspects, as I've mentioned. The next slide, please. So this map shows historic assets within the borough, from historic parks and gardens to scheduled monuments and listed buildings. And you can see a significant portion of the borough is covered under these classifications. And the evolution of the borough has resulted in this varied character, where we have a mixture of historic elements and also newer buildings. Next slide, please. As part of the study, a set of maps are being produced that will communicate the variety in character across the borough. A number of physical, economic, and social aspects will make areas of potential intensification more apparent. So, for instance, potential areas of intensification might include well-connected areas. So in the map on the top right, you see where the main train stations are. So those could be sites of potential intensification. On the top, sorry, on the top right rather, you see areas that are more or less deprived, and so we can then identify places that might need more investment. Next slide, please. Following some studies, our consultants produced this map, which defines neighborhood areas. So it defines 6 main neighborhood areas and 36 sub areas, and each sub area delineates a place with a consistent character. Although these delineations are not very definitive in some areas, because some boundaries are not as sharp as others. And in the next series of maps, we'll go through an analysis of these different characteristics that go into delineating different neighborhoods. The next slide, please. So one thing that we started to map is the history. So this map shows the historical developments of the borough. And historical developments can help define boundaries between neighborhoods. And so in the map, you see areas of shaded in different colors, which correspond to when they were developed. And this shows developments within the borough from 1836 up to the present day. Next slide. Building typologies also help to define neighborhoods. And this map shows building typologies across the borough. And some areas have a very consistent building typology. For instance, Metro Land in Morden, and other areas might be characterized by a mix of different building types, Wimbledon Village, for instance. And you see in the map a sort of a clear pattern sort of emerging, where the different colors correspond to different building types. The next slide, please. Physical barriers such as the roads and railway lines and the tram line also creates boundaries between neighborhoods, and sometimes very hard boundaries between neighborhoods. And so this can be another way of determining where a neighborhood starts and another begins. Next slide. As we've already mentioned tonight, green spaces do make the borough, and the borough does have quite a number of green spaces. These also can create boundaries between neighborhoods, but oftentimes much softer boundaries. And these green spaces can in themselves have their own character, and that can help define a neighborhood. Next slide. Waterways equally provide boundaries between different neighborhoods, and the Wandle, it makes it sort of a definite edge between places in the borough, as you can see as it cuts through the borough on that map. Next slide. So employment areas often have their own characteristics, usually quite defined. They're not often their own character area or their own neighborhood, but they do form part of larger neighborhoods, oftentimes centers in themselves. Next slide. And of course, you know that there are a number of town centers and a number of parades across the borough. These also often act as focus points within a neighborhood. Again, they don't usually cross boundaries between neighborhoods, but they usually form the center, very often form the center of a neighborhood. And they can often have impacts well beyond their physical boundaries. Wimbledon Town Center, for instance. Next slide. So as Catherine mentioned, we had a public consultation that was done earlier in September. And the map that was created by our consultants was edited following feedback from members of the public. And so this map just recaps some of the changes that were made. So I'll just briefly go through the major edits. So South Wimbledon, which has now become a character area in its own right. Merton Park was extended south to Kingston Road and Morden, not including the town centre. And Cops Hill is now part of Wimbledon and has been renamed West Wimbledon. Next slide. And as Catherine mentioned, we held a stakeholder workshop with residents and resident groups. And since that workshop, in that workshop, we tried to fine tune the mapping that had already been done. So we discussed each of these character areas and sub areas with residents and residents groups. And given with the feedback that we've been given, we are now currently amending the map again, just making small changes to fine tune the map. So for instance, West Wimbledon now includes all of the conservation area rather than sort of cutting it off as it previously was. So next slide. So just to kind of recap all of those maps that we've been through, it's all about creating this character study, and the purpose of it is to draw out the distinctiveness in the different areas of the borough. And it's really about asking the question how each area has evolved and how could it evolve in the future. And then lastly, we're looking at growth, and we're looking at how and where we might deliver growth. And the spectrum on the bottom of the screen there ranges from repair to reimagine, and this is basically the range of approach that could be taken in intensifying housing provision in any given area. So a repair, we see that being taken in more sensitive historic settings, where the existing built fabric perhaps shouldn't be messed around with, let's say, too much, and all the way to reimagine, where we would expect perhaps a more intensive development would help to actually improve the character of the area. And just to say that we have the worksheets that we use in our stakeholder workshop, which we can circulate after this meeting to councillors. And so we'll be doing that, and it would be really helpful to get your feedback on the work that's been done so far. So over to Catherine.
Lovely. So looking at the next steps for the character study, it's developing a policy approach. We've already been feeding in the ideas into the new local plan policies, and it will be published as an SPD and adopted following a formal 6-week consultation next year. Do you have any questions for us?
Carl, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Carl.
Thanks, guys. I was just saying I can't see everybody waving because you're still sharing your screen. But
let me turn that off.
Has just popped up on my screen, so I'll go straight to him first, if that's all right. Councillor Pearce. Dennis, would you like to?
Yeah, I'm still on the. Thank you. I, as most of you know, am a councillor and I live in the St Helier ward, which is part of the old estate. Now, we're talking about heritage and character, and I've seen an awful lot in the developments. Oh, it's better. I've seen an awful lot in the developments over my I've lived here since '83, but I've been a councillor for nearly 23 years. The changes that have already been sort of put upon the St Helier estate as a whole, because half of it is in Sutton, as people know, but in St Helier, there have been so many changes to the way rows of houses look, the way the area looks and so on, that the heritage is disappearing and the nature of the estate is disappearing. And because of developments, all those little green spaces that made the estate what it should started out to be have already gone. Is there any way that that could be addressed, or are we going to move further away from that as we build more? I don't know who wants to answer that, or whether it's just a comment.
Shall I take that, Chair?
Yeah.
Thanks, Dennis. Yes, you're right. St Helier is a very, very distinct character, that garden suburb character that stretches all the way into Sutton. And in some cases, there have been developments that have changed the way the layout of the estate originally looked. The character study doesn't propose changing matters massively at all at St Helier, but it is the case in some cases that small infill developments might be appropriate, especially where it brings extra symmetry. So, for example, where symmetry has been lost, it could be that a small development on the opposite side of, say, a butterfly wing could bring extra symmetry. But it is the case that St Helier is a very established character. And in reality, we see very few schemes for new homes come through at St Helier and beyond.
Can I have just a comment on that? The thing I'm mostly noticed is where houses have been extended sideways or houses have been filled in, and they don't actually they obviously represent housing for people who need it, but they don't actually enhance the area at all. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Butler, I saw next, if you're happy to ask your question.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for that presentation. Firstly, very happy as a biased Abbey Ward councillor to see South Wimbledon recognised as an area in that character study there. I was interested more in the types of people taking part in these workshops, especially, but also the survey. And I'm wondering if there are any themes that you could pull out if you did kind of carry this information of ages of the people involved in these consultations, their views on and how that differs in terms of their views on certain character areas, but also very interested in that the scale at the end there, the repair, reinforce, reinvent. Is there a special difference between certain types of people, certain maybe occupational life stage, even families that have different views on those? I'd be interested in that.
I could take part of that. So in terms of that survey where we had a response from over 400 residents, I don't think we asked people their age in that survey. We did do a big survey for the housing delivery research, and I think it was more than 2,000 responses, and we did get a lot of responses from younger people. That's people under the age of 45, but even under the age of 18, and that was really heavily pushed out on social media. So we do have some of that data on what people's sort of housing choice would be in future, as a separate piece of work, which we will be sharing at a later date when it's finalised. Remind me of the next thing. The reinforce reimagine. So I don't think we can say at this stage who specifically would support reinforced reimagine. That's not something that we asked during the survey. That's something that our consultants are gathering all the information from the survey, from the workshops, and all of their historic analysis of the built environment and our open spaces, and they will be making recommendations, and then we will be consulting on that next year.
Thank you, Catherine. Does that answer all your questions?
On that theme, I might come back with a couple of questions later, if that's okay, Chair.
Okay. I'm aware that Councillor Fairclough has been trying to get in, but I'd like to just quickly, before we go to you, if you don't mind, just check in with Councillor Stanford to see if you want to come in, because I know last time you ended up coming in at the end. So I just wanted to check in, Geraldine, if you'd like to come in at this point.
No, I'm okay at the moment, I think. Thank you.
Okay, great. Councillor Fairclough.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I think it was really interesting. I'd quite like at some point if the details of the digital survey might be published in more detail than those slides. That one with what people value about the different areas, I think could be really interesting to see in a bit more detail. My question was about how you envisage the SPD to look in due course, and what kind of policies you think this SPD will contain, specifically how it maybe overlaps with the site allocations in the local plan, or is it not that kind of thing that we expect to have in it? Is it more a design code rather than this type of development in this kind of area? What's envisaged to be in the SPD?
I can take this, Chair, if that's okay. There's a difference between local planning, SPD, and the SPD can only ever be guidance. So whatever we put in here is meant to advise councillors and any other decision maker about how to apply policies. A classic phrase in design policies right across England is it should reinforce or it should respect local character. And what comes up time and again is, well, what is the local character for this area? And often in a planning application, there's a huge variety of views on what the local character is and how it should be respected or reimagined or reinforced. And the SPD we're proposing, the guidance we're proposing, is really to give a pretty thorough piece of research that says in this area, our guidance is going to say this is the type of local character and these are the positives about it and these are the things that could be strengthened or should be let go. And that's really to try and just give a consistency, really, I suppose, across and help with the debate at planning decisions and planning committee, so that there is a piece of work that helps to define local character, and that importantly, residents and community groups and lots of other people have had an input into that. We already have that in some parts of the borough. We have conservation area appraisals, which are essentially exactly the same thing, but for a conservation area only. So this will give us something that's right across the borough. And it will include the conservation areas too. It won't just stop at the boundaries. So the conservation areas, if you like, have an extra layer of guidance. So in a nutshell, really, every time a planning application comes in and there's talk about local character, this guidance will help the decision makers make a decision about the scheme and have a look at the surrounding local character.
Councillor Butler, do you want to come back in quickly?
Yeah, I was quite interested in the little mention of employment areas and the effect that they can have on people's views on the character of areas. I'm very wary that this point might not hit where I want it to hit, but in terms of behaviours in terms of commuting into central London and expecting certain commercial spaces locally, Abbey Ward, for instance, South Wimbledon has a different expectation to the rest of the borough, for instance, and especially Wimbledon Town Centre, in the amount of commercial space and local employment that they expect in the area, and the area has a history of. I was wondering kind of the weights, the perceived weight of local employment in Merton to people's vision of the area's character, and how, when the consultations took place, might actually affect that, in terms of people thinking, well, in the future I might want to work locally, and that might be a big part of the character of the area as well. Big sweeping question. Don't know if you can answer it, but here we
go. We carried out the first part of our survey in August, and I think as the weeks and months goes on, people are starting to crystallise a bit more about what they want and what they see and how they're going to work in the future. I don't recall the details, but I don't think we got masses of feedback from the August consultation about that. It's probably still felt a bit early. It's amazing how even the difference between July, August and November, December has sort of crystallised in our thinking more and more. What has always come out of these things is the importance of high streets, the importance of, I want to be able to go to a high street locally. I want it to be somewhere that has things for me, whether it is food or coffee or a play place for my children. Those are the kind of things that come out much more strongly nearly than the industrial areas, which don't tend to get masses of comments, apart from possibly slightly negative ones about the attractiveness. But the high street, whether it's Wimbledon Town Centre or whether it's a very small parade in Lavender Ward, it always comes out very, very strongly about the importance of that, importance of the uses there.
Thank you, Tara. Is anyone else looking to come in? Councillor Pearce?
Yes, thank you. I would like to mention that the borough in many places has a great transport system, but I don't know whether you share my view that in certain areas, like the St Helier Ravensbrück, the transport in those areas tend to be more directed out of borough, i.e. St Helier residents will go to Sutton rather than go to Morton or Wimbledon. And I think the better the transport system, the more vibrant the area seems to be. Is there any way of looking forward when we do all these sort of consultations to actually change, not changing, because transport system is very seriously under pressure at the moment, but is there any way that redirecting certain transport links would benefit the borough that are feasible for us to do? I don't know who wants to answer that, or whether it's going to leave that in the air, if you like. It's just a thought.
I can take that, Councillor, if you like. I'm afraid that wasn't something we looked at as part of this study. It didn't have that level of scope. But one thing that has come out strongly is that it's how people identify with their area, and they don't necessarily see themselves always as gravitating towards the nearest town centre in Merton, as you rightly say. So there are people living up in the northwest of Merton that might see Norbury or even parts of Streatham as their local area. And there's certainly people living in the sort of north of Figs Marsh that might gravitate more towards Tooting. And then other people living, as you say, in the south of St Helier that might gravitate more towards Sutton. But so one of the things we got from the consultation feedback was how people saw the character didn't just stop at Merton boundaries, that really they felt they were part of different kind of social areas than maybe we have planning jurisdiction for.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Butler, you'd like to come back in again?
Yeah, you're hearing a lot of me. Thank you, Chair. And this is again, another thing based on very recent experience. I'm going on a lot of walks recently, and something that I really like is the way our green spaces connect different areas within, that are kind of on those maps there. Was there any indication, any themes coming out of not only wanting the character to stay within those areas that people recognize, but opportunities for certain points where they're thinking, this is where I can actually connect to, this is where I like going down to Wimbledon Town Centre, for instance, and this is how my area connects to this area, and so on. Is there any kind of themes coming out where that give us indications of how, on those borders, how to make them softer?
Catherine, can I pass that to you if there was anything?
Yeah, so I do know that in the resident survey, people were given the opportunity to comment on things like what they thought defined the boundary of their area, and green spaces would have been one of them. We haven't seen the full results of the survey yet, so it's something that I think we would have to wait until we got the full character study back, and that would be making recommendations. But yes, the sorts of things that you were saying.
Really looking forward to more detail.
Thank you for that. So it's looking like everyone's asked all the questions that they want to at this point. Just one last call if anyone wants to jump in. Tara's got a question.
I've got a comment, Chair. Thank you. As Abre said, that we have feedback, sort of summary versions for the different neighbourhoods: Colliers Wood, Wrens Park, South Wimbledon, Mitcham, Morden and Wimbledon, which we will circulate to councillors after the meeting. It just gives an idea of some of the things the questions that were asked for each of those neighbourhoods.
Thanks for that, Tara. And I guess it will be useful for councillors to share this consultation once it comes out and get it out to our networks as well. So
yes, once the study's finished, it will come back to the Borough Plan panel to say, this is the finished article. We'd like to go to 6 weeks public consultation. That will definitely happen in the new year rather than rest of this year.
Fantastic. Well, I think that brings us to the end. In case
I think Joan has mentioned she's got a question in the chat.
Joan, well spotted. Joan, would you like to type the question in? I'm not sure you can come in verbally or on video, but if you want to type your question, I think we can put it. In fact, here you are. You can come in now. If you'd like to turn your microphone on, you can quickly ask a question.
Oh, thank you. Okay, as you all know, I am one of the councillors in Pollardhill. Pollardhill is divided because one section of Pollardhill, most people think it's Mitcham, and they take the area is divided like poor and rich. So common side east, it's like more upmarket comparing to Pollardhill Centre. And how are we working? How are you going to work together so we get the ward to be one instead of divided? Does that make sense?
Who'd like to come in?
Thanks, Councillor. I think that's a very good question. It's a very tough question. There's quite a number of political boundaries of wards where there are huge contrasts within them. And in actual fact, it's quite similar for most of our town centres, because most of our town centres, for example, Morden, are at the confluence of several wards. So I'm not sure that in planning terms or through this study, we're going to be able to marry up economic or any other types of divides within a certain ward. I think what's came out quite strongly from some feedback we had from Pollardhill is that, especially from the eastern side of it, was that they often gravitate more as much towards parts of Croydon and parts of Norbury in seeing themselves as a community as they do with Merton. So some of that feedback came back through what we've seen so far. But unfortunately, I'm not sure that we'll be able to, through the study, marry up internal wards.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Great. Well, I think that means we are drawing to a close. Thank you to everybody that's presented. It's been fascinating, both fascinating presentation, fascinating discussion.